A young nurse donated her kidney to a patient, not knowing he was the lonely CEO millionaire. The morning air was cool, touched by a whisper of fall as Sarah Jennings stepped off the bus and made her way toward the hospital. She pulled her worn cardigan tighter around her scrubs and walked briskly through the quiet streets of the suburban neighborhood. The hospital wasn't large, not compared to the glistening private centers downtown, but it was where she belonged, the place she had chosen to give her time, her energy, her heart, and soon her kidney. Sarah, 28, had been a nurse at Westbridge General for almost 5 years. She was known for her calm presence, her steady hands, and the way she smiled softly, even when the world felt heavy. But what most people did not know was that she had once sat in a different waiting room, not as a nurse, but as a sister, helpless, praying for a miracle that never came. Her brother, Andrew, had been 28 when he died, polycystic kidney disease. He had waited on a donor list for nearly a year. The match never came. The grief had shaped her, hollowed something inside her, but also planted something else, resolve. After his funeral, Sarah walked into the donor registry center and filled out the forms. She chose to be an anonymous living donor, not for recognition, not for anything in return. Just the quiet hope that maybe somewhere someone else would be given a chance that Andrew never got. It had been over a year since then, and then 3 days ago, she received the call. There was a patient in critical condition, late-stage renal failure, rare blood type. Time was running out, 72 hours at best. Her blood type, O negative, made her one of the few viable matches in the database. The voice on the other end of the line was calm but urgent. "You do not have to decide now," they told her. But she already had. Now, as she sat in the pre-op room, clothed in a pale blue gown and hooked up to monitors, she felt more at peace than afraid. A soft knock came at the door before Dr. Keene stepped in, a familiar face, and one she trusted. "Well, begin in 30 minutes, he said gently. "You sure?" Sarah nodded. "I want this. Do you want to know who the recipient is?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, that's not why I'm doing it." Dr. Keene gave her a look of quiet admiration. "You are one of the bravest people I know." She smiled faintly. "Not brave, just doing what I wish someone had done for my brother." As the team prepped for surgery, Sarah stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the seconds between the beeping of machines. Somewhere in another part of the hospital, someone was waiting. She pictured a shadowed figure lying still, hooked to dialysis lines, lungs heavy with fluid, heart slowing with every passing day. She hoped he or she had someone holding their hand. The surgery took 4 hours. When she woke, there was pain, sharp and dull, like something missing inside her, but it was manageable, bearable. More than anything, she felt relief. In another recovery room far away from hers, a man was waking up. Richard Cole, 32, had never been the kind of man who asked for help. CEO of Arcadia Properties, the youngest real estate mogul in the region, he had built his empire on precision, control, and silence. But illness had stripped all of that away. For 2 years, his body had failed him faster than any deal could fix. He had been days from death when the call came. A donor had been found. The doctors had warned him not to get his hopes up. Matches this clean were rare. But this one had saved his life. He woke to the sound of machines beeping steadily, color back in his cheeks, breath easier than it had been in months. "Who was it?" he asked, voice cracked from anesthesia. The nurse looked up from his chart. "Anonymous young woman." She did not want to be identified. Richard blinked at the ceiling. He had built towers, sold dreams on brochures, conquered skylines, but now he owed everything to a name he would never know. And somewhere down the hallway, the woman with the soft eyes and quiet resolve slept alone, never knowing that she had just saved the man who had once believed nothing in the world could touch him, not even kindness. Sarah returned to work 12 days after the surgery, her pace slower, her movements more careful. The sharp ache beneath her ribs still flared if she bent too quickly or lifted anything too heavy, but she said nothing. Nurses were used to working through pain, emotional or physical. You learned to push past it. Smile, move on. She smiled as always, even if it didn't reach her eyes. "You're looking a little thinner, Sarah," one of the texts said as they passed in the hallway. "Probably just the cafeteria food," she joked, shifting her tray of charts from one hip to the other. No one asked further. In truth, her appetite had not returned since the surgery. It wasn't just the painkillers or the physical toll. It was the emotional undercurrent that still pulled at her when the corridors grew quiet. She had given a part of herself to someone she would never meet, never thank, never ask if they were okay, and maybe that was for the best. But sometimes, alone in the supply room, or staring into her reflection under the harsh break-room light, she remembered Andrew. 2 years ago, he had sat in the same waiting room she'd now passed every day. He was 28, sarcastic, kind, full of dreams. He had played guitar on the weekends, left sticky notes with jokes on the fridge, and called her sunshine, even when chemo made him too tired to smile. He had waited month after month, tied to machines, living between numbers, creatinine levels, blood pressure, dialysis schedules. She had offered to donate, but they were not a match. She had begged doctors, prayed to ceilings, screamed in her car until her throat gave out. But Andrew had died anyway, and some part of her had died with him. That was why she said yes, not because she was brave, but because she could not bear the thought of someone else's sister watching their brother fade away. She did not want recognition. She wanted meaning, quiet, life-giving meaning. Far from the small hospital, in a sprawling estate by the lake, Richard Cole stared at the still water outside his window. The autumn light hit the glass just right, turning the lake to gold, but it brought him no peace. The mansion was beautiful. High ceilings, modern lines, wide spaces filled with curated silence, the kind of place realtors fought over. But for Richard, it was only a shell, a monument to everything he had built and everything he had lost. He used to imagine this place filled with laughter. He and Natalie had toured the empty plot together, barefoot on gravel, dreaming of a family. She had wanted a dog. He had promised a garden, but the future never came. Natalie had been diagnosed late. Her kidneys failed rapidly. There had been no match, no miracle. Money could not buy what they needed. He had tried everything, private clinics, donor drives, even international contacts. But in the end, none of it mattered. She had died in a hospital room overlooking the city's skyline. He had held her hand and felt powerless for the first time in his life. Now, 2 years later, it was a stranger's hand, unseen, unnamed, that had saved him. He had expected to feel relief after the transplant. Instead, he felt small. Someone had walked into a hospital, offered up a part of themselves, and walked out, expecting nothing in return. It shook him. The man who once negotiated billion-dollar land deals could not even find the words to say thank you. He glanced at the mail on the counter. Condolence letters from board members who had feared the worst. Hospital bills already covered by his company's elite insurance. None of it meant anything compared to the simple truth. He was alive because someone he did not know had chosen to save him. And suddenly that gift, that anonymous mercy, felt heavier than anything he had ever owned. The corridors of Street Clare Hospital were quieter than usual that Thursday afternoon. Outside, the wind tugged at the trees, scattering golden leaves across the sidewalks. Inside, Richard Cole walked briskly beside the head of the hospital's development board, his coat collar turned up, sunglasses still on, though they were now deep inside the building. This program would cover full transplant procedures for uninsured patients, pre- and post-op care included, the board member explained, eager, gesturing with a folder. I read the proposal, Richard replied, his voice low and even. I'll fund it. The man blinked fully. Richard nodded once quietly. I don't want my name on anything. Before the man could respond with a stunned thank you, Richard added, just let me know when you're ready to start. He glanced toward the hallway ahead. I'll find my way out. He needed space, air, something. Wandering the maze of hospital corridors, Richard found himself pausing outside a narrow room near the end of the west wing. Through the small glass window, he spotted a scene that made him stop completely. Inside, a young nurse knelt beside an elderly man with matted grey hair and trembling hands. The man looked confused, his clothing thin and dirty, his voice inaudible. But the nurse, blonde, delicate, steady, was smiling as she adjusted the oxygen tubes near his nose and gently patted his shoulder. Her presence was grounding. She moved without hurry, without judgment. When the man gripped her wrist suddenly, as if afraid she might vanish, she didn't flinch. She leaned closer, listening. Something about the way she looked at him, not just with compassion, but with real patience, pulled at something buried inside Richard. He stood there for a long moment watching her. Then he turned and left. The next morning he was back. He did not know why. He sat on a bench in the hallway outside the same wing, pretending to scroll through his phone, but every so often his eyes drifted to the nurse's station, and there she was again, Sarah, moving between patients, checking charts, greeting colleagues with a soft nod. He recognized her before he realized it. It was the same woman from yesterday, and she was even more composed today, more present in the quiet, unseen ways that most people never noticed. She had that unshakable steadiness that was rare in his world of noise and ego. He stayed an hour, then another. No one asked him who he was. He wore a dark hoodie and jeans. No one looked twice. Over the next 2 weeks, he returned 3 more times, always sitting in the same place, always watching from a distance. Sarah began to notice, not with suspicion, just quiet curiosity. The man in the hoodie sitting near the window, never speaking, never making trouble, just being there. He looked older than most of the interns, younger than most of the donors. Broad shoulders, a sharp jawline, eyes that always seemed to be somewhere else entirely. And something about him, his silence maybe, felt oddly familiar, but she never approached. Hospitals were filled with stories. Not all of them needed to be told. One afternoon, Richard sat on the bench longer than usual. The sounds of monitors and soft intercom announcements blurred into the background. 2 doctors passed by near the nurses' station. Still no word on the donor. One asked, "No. All they told us was it was a young woman, blood type O, did not leave a name, refused any compensation." Richard looked up. The words hung in the air, heavy and ringing. A young woman, type O, no name, no payment. He turned his gaze to Sarah just as she bent to tie a patient's shoe in a wheelchair. Something in his chest shifted. Could it be her? His heart pounded with the question he dared not ask. It was impossible coincidence. Thousands of donors in the world, right? But the pieces, it fit. She had that kind of heart, the kind that saved without expecting to be thanked. He stayed until the hallway lights dimmed for evening rounds. Then he left quietly, unnoticed, heart caught between gratitude and disbelief. If it was her, how could he ever look her in the eyes and say the words he now carried like a stone in his throat? "You saved me." The hospital corridor felt colder that morning. The fluorescent lights harsher than usual. Richard had arrived early, unplanned. Something compelled him to check in on the transplant wing before his first meeting of the day. Then he saw her, Sarah. She was standing at the nurses' station, her face pale, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She reached for a clipboard, swayed slightly, and then collapsed. The sound of it startled everyone nearby, but Richard was the first to move. He rushed forward as another nurse called for help. By the time anyone reacted, he was already kneeling beside her, lifting her gently into his arms. "I've got her," he said firmly. "Call off the ER. I'll take care of her." No one dared question him, not when he carried the weight of Arcadia's donations behind every word. He brought her to a private wing, his private wing, inside a partnered facility just across the street, one built with Arcadia funding for post-operative care and executive wellness programs. Quiet, safe. Richard placed Sarah down carefully on the recliner in one of the recovery suites, adjusting the blanket over her body. She was still unconscious, her breath shallow but steady. A nurse came in with fluids and basic vitals equipment. "Looks like anemia, possibly post-op fatigue," she said after checking. "I'll run blood work, but she needs rest, serious rest." Richard nodded. "I'll stay with her." The nurse raised an eyebrow but didn't object. She quietly slipped out, leaving them alone. For a long while, Richard simply sat beside Sarah, watching her chest rise and fall. His fingers twitched with the urge to do something. But this wasn't a boardroom. He could not negotiate the return of someone's strength. Still, he reached over and gently moved a strand of hair from her forehead. It was strange the way peace began to settle over him just sitting there. Hours passed. Sarah stirred. She blinked groggily, then tried to sit up, but the movement sent pain through her side. Richard was beside her in an instant. "Easy," he said, his voice low and calm. "You fainted." She looked around, confused. "Where am I?" "A recovery suite, just across from the hospital." "You brought me here?" she asked, struggling to process it. He nodded. "You were pushing too hard." Sarah looked away, flustered. "I'm fine." "No, you're not," he said softly. He gave something big. "You can't pretend like that didn't cost you." There was silence between them, a tension not of discomfort, but recognition. She shifted to sit up again, this time slower. As she did, her gown slipped slightly at the side, revealing a dressing near her ribcage. A corner had come loose. Before she could fix it, Richard caught a glimpse of what lay beneath. A scar, small, faint, but unmistakable, right beneath her rib, right where his own was. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. Sarah looked at him, following his eyes, then down to the dressing. Her fingers moved to cover it, but too late. Their eyes met. Neither spoke for a moment. Richard swallowed hard, the truth unraveling in the space between heartbeats. "It was you," he whispered. "You gave me life, and I didn't even know your name." Sarah didn't move. She didn't blink. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I never did it for gratitude," she said. "I just wanted someone to live." The words hung in the air, soft and unshakable. Richard looked down, blinking back something raw in his eyes. "You were the reason I woke up," he murmured. "All this time I tried to find the person, and you were right here." Sarah offered a small, tired smile. "Sometimes the right people find you when they are supposed to." He nodded slowly, still overwhelmed, not just by the truth, but by the weight of her quiet strength. In that moment, nothing grand was said, no declarations, no drama, just a man who realized he owed more than his life to the woman in front of him, and a woman who had given without asking for anything in return. But now something had changed. Everything had. The morning after their silent revelation, Sarah expected things to shift. Maybe for Richard to pull away, or vanish behind the same wall of formality that men of his stature often used as armor. Instead, he showed up in her world with surprising gentleness. An intention. It began with an invitation. He approached her during a quiet shift change, waiting until the nurses cleared the hallway. "There's a volunteer event this weekend," he said casually, hands tucked in his coat pockets. "A community organ donation drive. We're sponsoring it. I thought you might want to be there. You'd bring a kind of credibility." Sarah blinked. "You want me to speak?" "No," he said, smiling. "Just be there. Walk with me. Show people what compassion looks like." She hesitated, unsure of the real motive behind his words. He added, "It is a real event. You can check the flyers in the staff lounge." That earned a small laugh. "Fine, but only if I get to wear scrubs instead of a suit." "Deal." That Saturday, under a white tent on the edge of a local park, Sarah stood beside Richard for hours as people came to register as organ donors, ask questions, or light candles in memory of loved ones. Richard was warm but reserved, careful not to steal the spotlight. He let Sarah lead. She was a natural with people, calming, direct, sincere. Richard watched as she comforted a mother who had lost a son, hugged an elderly man who had been waiting for a kidney for years. He said little, but he noticed everything, and slowly so did she. The next day, he sent a thank you note to the hospital board and copied her on it. The day after that, he invited her for coffee at a quiet spot behind the hospital's greenhouse. No staff, no cameras. Soon they began spending more time together, not in fancy restaurants, but in patient rooms, side by side. Sarah taught him how to roll a patient without hurting their back, how to speak to someone on a ventilator, how to measure pain in someone who had stopped speaking. Richard in return offered something she hadn't realized she needed: resources. "Your clinic still using paper records?" he asked one afternoon, shocked. She shrugged. "We make do." By the end of that week, he had helped her draft a grant application for new computers, tablets, and updated infrastructure. When she struggled with the language, he simplified the proposal without making her feel incapable. "You do the healing," he said. "Let me handle the red tape." Then came the flowers. Every morning when she arrived at the nurse's station, a small vase sat on the counter, always with a single white freezer. Sarah never told anyone she liked white freezers. Not her colleagues, not even her roommate. The first time she noticed, she simply stared at it for a long moment. Maya, her fellow nurse, teased, "Secret admirer." Sarah just smiled, but her mind already knew. One morning, she found Richard standing near the stairwell with a coffee in hand. "Was it you?" she asked, motioning toward the flower. He didn't deny it, just offered a soft smile. "I notice things," he said. Sarah looked at him. "Really?" Looked at the man who used to seem untouchable, the one who now rolled up his sleeves to clean wounds, who stood quietly in the hallway after every shift, as if waiting for her to pass by. She felt something shift, not in the air, but inside her chest. There was no grand confession, no dramatic kiss, just two people, slowly stitching a bond through shared silences, stolen moments, and quiet gestures. And in those days that followed, they found something they had both forgotten how to feel: belonging. Not because of the kidney, not because of gratitude, but because love, real love, had finally come. Not as a whirlwind, but as a whisper. At first it was a whisper, a few curious glances in the hospital hallway, An extra pause when someone greeted Sarah at the nurse's station, a question disguised as casual. "So, you and the Arcadia guy, huh?" Then came the articles. Savior or social climber, from nurse to notable. Is it love or leverage? CEO Millionaire linked to former organ donor. Sarah had not seen them coming. One morning, she opened her locker to find a printed tabloid page taped to the inside. A blurry photo of her walking with Richard in the hospital garden was circled in red. She ripped it off quickly, hoping no one else had noticed, but they had. Whispers turned into silence. Colleagues who once asked her to cover their shifts suddenly stopped replying to her messages. Some looked at her with pity, others with thinly veiled contempt. Maya, her only real ally, warned her, "You're not doing anything wrong, but you're in their crosshairs now. They think you're using him." Sarah wanted to laugh at the absurdity. She had given up a part of her body, her actual kidney, before she even knew who Richard Cole was. But the world did not care about truth. It cared about headlines. Soon, reporters began calling her cell. A few showed up outside the hospital. One particularly aggressive blogger uncovered her brother's death, spinning it as a trauma-driven obsession with rich, sick men. That was the final straw. She confronted Richard in the Arcadia atrium, where they were supposed to meet for a press-free lunch. "I can't keep doing this," she said, voice trembling. "They're twisting everything. My work, my name, even my brother's death." His face was calm, unreadable. "I know it's hard." "No, you don't," she snapped, then immediately regretted it. "I mean, you've lived your life behind gates with a PR team. I do not have those walls. I have a name badge and a tiny apartment." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Then, let me build walls around you." But Sarah shook her head. "Richard, this isn't your battle. I don't want to be the scandal that slows down your empire. I don't want people thinking you're some charity case I fell in love with." His jaw tightened. "Is that what they're saying now? It's what they'll keep saying, and I can't keep standing in the fire hoping it doesn't burn." She turned before he could stop her. For 3 days, Sarah didn't answer his calls. She needed space and silence. The hospital agreed to transfer her to another department temporarily away from the media chaos. She buried herself in work, trying to feel useful again. Then came the gala, Arcadia's largest annual event. A black-tie fundraiser supporting affordable housing and medical partnerships. The guest list was packed with politicians, celebrities, industry leaders. It was not a place Sarah ever imagined herself. But that night, dressed in the same simple navy dress she wore to her brother's memorial, she was there on the sidelines, invited anonymously. She stood near the back unnoticed, or so she thought, until Richard appeared on stage. The room quieted instantly. Cameras lifted, phones blinked. The CEO everyone thought they knew, the recluse, the real estate genius, the man who avoided interviews, was now under the spotlight. He took the microphone, eyes scanning the crowd. Then he spoke. "Most of you know me as the man behind Arcadia. The numbers, the buildings, the profits. But a year ago, I was dying." Murmurs rippled through the room. "I had a failing kidney, no family left, no hope. And then someone somewhere gave me life. A stranger." He paused. "That stranger is here tonight." Heads turned. Richard stepped off the stage and walked through the stunned crowd. He stopped in front of Sarah. Her breath caught. He took her hand gently and led her to the stage. Cameras flashed. Silence held the air. "She didn't just save my life," he said, voice steady. "She saved my heart." That content, the room erupted. Not with gossip, not with scandal, but with applause. In that moment, the narrative changed. Not from her defending herself, but from him choosing her publicly, proudly, permanently. 1 year later, everything had changed quietly but profoundly. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of the Life Exchange Foundation's new headquarters. The space was warm, welcoming. On one wall, framed portraits of donor-recipient pairs lined a hallway now known as the Hall of Second Chances. Sarah Jennings walked down that hallway with quiet purpose. Her ID badge, now reading Director of Humanitarian Programs. She had left her job at the hospital 6 months ago. Not because she stopped caring for patients, but because she realized she could help on a much broader scale. Every file on her desk now represented a life waiting to be saved. Every name a heartbeat worth fighting for. She still remembered the day the foundation was born. It started with a single conversation between her and Richard. Sitting cross-legged on the floor of his study, surrounded by notepads and coffee mugs. "What if," she had said, No one had to go through what we did alone. Richard had looked at her for a long time before answering. Then we built something that makes sure they never do. And they did. Together, they co-founded the Life Exchange Foundation, a non-profit that funded transplant procedures for underprivileged patients and offered recovery grants for anonymous donors. It was the first of its kind, bridging medicine, outreach, and advocacy. Richard returned to his role at Arcadia Properties, but not as the man he used to be. He no longer worked 18-hour days or kept people at a distance. He had restructured the company's mission to include wellness retreats for post-op patients and subsidized housing for long-term care families. Arcadia's luxury now had a conscience and a heartbeat. Still, every Friday afternoon, without fail, he was at the foundation office. No security, no entourage, just Richard, sleeves rolled up, reviewing donor applications or helping Sarah sort through funding requests. He called those his real estate of the soul hours. They worked side by side, not always talking, but always in rhythm. The silent kind of closeness that grows when two people have once touched death and chosen to fight for life instead. People in the foundation admired them both, but especially Sarah, not just for what she had given, but for what she continued to give: compassion, time, belief. One afternoon, as she stepped out of a donor family meeting, she caught sight of Richard standing by the front window, arms crossed, watching the city below. He turned and smiled at her, not the polite smile he used in boardrooms, but the one that belonged only to her. "How was the Reyes case?" he asked. "Approved," she said. "Surgery scheduled for next week." He nodded. "Good then." As if reading her mind, he added softly, "We're making a difference, aren't we?" Sarah looked around the space they had built. Once, just a dream scribbled on the back of a napkin, now a sanctuary of hope. "Yes," she said, "we are." And for the first time in a long time, she believed it with her whole heart. The late afternoon sun bathed the hospital garden in warm golden light, casting dappled shadows along the stone paths. The scent of blooming jasmine lingered in the air, soft and familiar. Richard Cole walked beside Sarah, their hands intertwined. It had been a long day, meetings, foundation calls, but this part, this he had planned from the heart. "I haven't been back here in over a year," he said, as they passed through the archway into the secluded garden behind the hospital's main wing. Sarah glanced around. "This is where they brought you after the transplant." He nodded. "I remember waking up here thinking it was a dream. I never imagined I'd return with you." Her smile was gentle as she squeezed his hand. The garden had changed since then. The benches were new, flowers brighter, but in the center stood the Japanese maple she had planted, a sapling, then now full of red and gold leaves. "Do you remember this?" she asked, touching a branch. "I watched you plant it from my window," he said. "I didn't know it was you until much later. I planted it for new beginnings." Richard stepped closer. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a small box. Sarah froze. "I wanted the right place," he said, his voice steady. "And then I realized it had to be here, where life began again." He dropped to one knee. "You gave me more than a kidney," he said softly. "You gave me hope. You never asked for thanks or recognition, and yet you saved me." He opened the box. Inside was a simple, timeless ring. "I don't know how much time we get, but whatever I have, I want to share it with you." His eyes met hers. "Sarah Jennings, will you marry me?" Tears spilled down her cheeks. She laughed, breathless, and whispered, "Yes, yes, of course." He stood, and she wrapped her arms around him. The world felt still, like it was holding its breath just for them. Moments later, still hand in hand, they knelt beside the maple. Richard pulled a second sapling from a cloth bag, a sister tree. Together, they planted it in the soft earth. Sarah held the root steady, while Richard patted down the soil. As they stood, he brushed dirt from his hands and pointed to a small plaque resting against a stone nearby. Sarah leaned in. Engraved in clean silver letters were the words, "It didn't start with love, it started with life." Her eyes filled again, this time not from pain, but from peace, from joy, from something whole. As the sun dipped low behind the garden wall, the two trees stood side by side. Their leaves rustled gently in the breeze, alive, rooted, growing, just like them. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey of love, loss, and second chances. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the quiet power of kindness, hit the hype button. Subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more heartfelt tales that linger long after they end. Until next time, Keep believing in the goodness of strangers and the magic of a life given freely. Music.